May 8, 1945. After almost 6 years of brutal and bloody conflicts, the German armies laid down their weapons, signing their unconditional surrender and achieving the longed-for peace in Europe. Many of the exhausted Nazi soldiers thought that this was the end of their hardships and that they could return home. But they could not have been further from the truth. Although the conflict had ended, the disputes between the combatant countries still continued. Many of the victors had come across the atrocities committed by the Germans in the concentration camps. Witnessing the inhuman treatment to which they had subjected so many people, mainly the Jews, ignited in some of them a deep desire for revenge. And who better to suffer this retribution than the captured German prisoners?
A dog in a doghouse would have had it better. He's got shelter, a roof over his head. He has maybe some hay. The fact is that for whatever reason, however they justified it to themselves, we were handled worse than animals.
For the victorious nations, it was poetic justice that the victims became the victimizers. But for the defeated, this only meant the beginning of a brutal agony. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the terrible experiences of the Nazi prisoners in the Allied concentration camps after the Second World War.
I was thinking then, if soldiers are capable of doing this to other soldiers, then we can expect them to do just about anything to us.
By the time World War II came to a close in Europe, the German military was in a state of near total destruction. 4.3 million soldiers had died fighting on the world's battlefields, and far more had been wounded or maimed. But now that hostilities had come to an end, Allied leaders were beginning to worry about what to do with the survivors. Some 11 million Germans were in prisoner of war camps, anxiously awaiting word of their fate. Of that number, 8 million were prisoners of the British and the Americans. Many of the countries involved in the war, including the Allies, Russia, and Germany, had signed the Hague Treaties at the beginning of the 20th century, which detailed how combatants captured during armed conflict should be treated. Among the agreed-upon points was that these people should be given food, clothing, and access to housing. Any mistreatment of them was strictly prohibited. For the signatory governments, this was a way of humanizing war. However, in practice, these agreements were rarely respected. The Nazis were one of the first to ignore the decree. During their brutal campaign of expansion, every captured enemy combatant was completely at the mercy of the German officer in charge. Many of them were taken to forced labor camps, where they experienced incredibly cruel living conditions. Others were massacred, executed en masse by the weapons of their executioners. This was the fate of those considered inferior by the Nazis, such as those of African origin or descent, or the Slavs of the Red Army. It was not surprising, then, that when Germany was close to defeat, many of its soldiers feared for their future. They had already heard the rumors coming from the East. Anyone who surrendered to the Soviets was killed, in revenge for the atrocities committed against the population of that country. For this reason, many of the Germans sought to leave their weapons to the Western Allies, hoping for better treatment.
At first, I was happy to be in the West, because we all thought, if we're taken prisoner, we'll be better off with the Americans. And so I surrendered, with the hope of humane treatment. I had no idea what the next 5 months would bring and how disappointed we would become.
However, a bitter surprise awaited them in the prisons to which they were taken. In 1929, another series of agreements had been signed, this time in Geneva, which declared that the prisoners were to be placed in the care of the Red Cross. In addition, once the conflict for which they had been captured was over, they were to be released as quickly as possible. But already in 1943, the Allies made a secret pact among themselves. German soldiers were to be treated as war criminals rather than regular combatants, so that the Geneva treaties would not apply. It was for this reason that after the German surrender on May 8, 1945, these soldiers suddenly found themselves unprotected by any international law that could safeguard their safety. To the number of those captured at the end of the war were also added those belonging to militias, such as the so-called Volkssturm, or People's Storm. Despite being made up mostly of the elderly, women, and children, the Allies considered them combatants worthy of the same treatment as regular soldiers. At first, it had been planned to move the Nazi prisoners to detention camps built in northern France. But at the last minute, Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces and future President of the United States, gave a different order. The captives were to be installed in new centers, established on the banks of the Rhine River, inside German territory. These places were much more precarious than the original destinations. From all over Germany, the Germans were loaded onto trucks. They were never told where they were going. At these moments, many of them may have remembered the trains full of Jews that marched to the different concentration camps. It was in these detention centers in their own homeland that the German soldiers were able to experience something similar to what they had administered for years.
In the first few days, we received nothing to eat or drink. And for the first time in my life, I had to experience men drinking their own urine. I even ate grass, like the others, but the human digestive system is not meant for that.
Some American guards were shocked by the disorganization with which the transfer of millions of prisoners was carried out. There were so many people crammed into places that clearly could not accommodate such numbers. There was also a notable lack of food, shelter, and sanitary conditions. Some Allied soldiers complained to their superiors, but the vast majority turned a deaf ear to the agonies of their until recently bitter enemies. To them, they deserved all that and much more. To others, the utter ruin in which Germany found itself after its surrender made it impossible to provide decent treatment for captured soldiers.
To my understanding, it was because the German civilians and the refugees had so little to eat that Eisenhower did not want to feed the soldiers any better than the civilian population, that he was worried about the overall food supply for the coming fall and winter of 1945.
However, the lack of food in the prisoner of war camps was deliberately planned by Eisenhower. The American general was following in the footsteps of the so-called Morgenthau Plan. Its aim was simple: to weaken Germany's industry so severely that it would not allow itself to become a military threat ever again. But this had the consequence, whether intended or not, of leaving the country without local food production. And with the German economy in ruins, they could not afford the exports needed to keep their population alive. Therefore, the Morgenthau Plan was cancelled in 1947 and replaced by a policy of aid. But for many Germans, it was too late. Hunger, killed huge numbers of the overcrowded prisoners. The exact number of captives is not known for sure, as the Americans did not keep accurate records. However, the exorbitant numbers made already dire conditions much worse. Prisoners had to fight each other for the little food that was available, and if one of them dared to complain to one of the guards, he was sure to receive a brutal beating. Corporal punishment seemed to have no purpose other than torment. The guards, frustrated that they could not return home even when the war in Europe was over, took it out on the Germans. Many were subjected to mock firing squads, roused from their beds in the middle of the night and taken to dark corners of the camp. There, they were informed that they would be executed for crimes committed during the conflict. They were made to face a platoon of Allied soldiers armed with rifles, or simply made to kneel on the floor with a pistol placed over their heads. Most begged for their lives, some accepted their death, but the bullet never came, and the guards holstered their weapons with laughter, leaving the victims severely traumatized. As if that were not enough, they also had to deal with the theft of the few belongings they had managed to keep. Cameras, photographs, even wedding rings were stolen by the guards. German watches in particular were highly coveted by the Americans. That is why the furious Germans began referring to the Allied forces as the Army of Watch Thieves.
The first thing was, I had to give up my watch. And the thought came over me, these rich Americans are going to steal our watches? That was pretty strange. But it was continuous.
Several prisoners were unable to bear the torture they suffered in these camps and decided to escape. But it was not an easy task. The captives were divided into groups of between 5,000 and 15,000 men, and then placed in areas with a capacity of only 1,000. These places were surrounded by barbed wire barriers, with sentries posted in towers, always watching. Most of those who tried to escape were captured again and were not given a second chance. This time, the shooting was real. But sometimes the guards went even further and punished the entire block of captives, shooting them blindly, just as the Nazis had done so many times against the Jews. Another problem that the prisoners had to face was exposure to the weather. Almost none of the captured had access to a roof that provided shelter. Instead, they were completely out in the open. At the end of the war, the weakest died quickly from exposure to the cold. The survivors had to find ways to create their own shelters. One alternative they found was to dig a hole out of whatever was nearby. Sometimes even an empty food can would do. The luckiest ones made do with pieces of cardboard to stop the winds. Often, 3 to 5 prisoners shared a single shelter, sharing body heat. However, what seemed like temporary salvation turned into a deadly trap for some. The heavy and frequent rains turned the ground in the camps into a quagmire. This caused the holes dug for both shelter and latrines to cease being safe ground and become death traps.
Many of the prisoners fell in, and they were never helped. But then they sank down into the cesspit, and they were gone. Nobody did anything to help them.
Hunger, thirst, lack of sleep and hygiene, coupled with the pressure from the guards, quickly led to Germans fighting each other. Anyone who had access to better food could be beaten by another hungry prisoner looking to steal his share. something similar had happened in the ghettos established by the Nazis throughout Europe, such as the one in Warsaw. There, desperate prisoners would reveal the crimes of those who had been friends or even family members in the hope of receiving a better food ration. In the Soviet Union, too, Germans had mocked Soviet prisoners, seeing them turned into almost animals for the slightest bit of food. Now, it was they who were experiencing these things firsthand.
I can remember it so clearly now. In 1942 to 44, we saw the Russian prisoners as being subhuman because they would even eat rats. Now for us, the situation was no different.
As the months of 1945 continued to pass, living conditions continued to worsen. The food situation was critical. It is estimated that the average daily calorie intake was only 400 to 900, far below the minimum of 2,000 recommended for a man. Water was also a precious resource. Prisoners had to wait in long lines, sometimes for more than 10 hours, to obtain something to drink. Often, this was only a cup. Even when conditions began to improve, daily consumption only increased to a maximum of 1,500 calories. The debilitation to which these people were subjected caused diseases such as typhus and cholera to wreak havoc within the camps, killing hundreds of prisoners. Despite the high death toll, the Americans showed no intention of helping their captives. They even denied them the possibility of others assisting them.
There was no medical care in the beginning, and there was no medical equipment set up. And the Americans did not allow German doctors to practice. And if they did so anyways, then it was only from their own resources and without medications and equipment. They could only help with advice or to try to mitigate the pain. The International Red Cross, as mentioned, was not allowed access to the camps. Food and relief supplies, which the Red Cross transported on trains to the camps, were ordered to be returned by Allied Commander Eisenhower.
By September 1945, many of these camps began to close. Many of the prisoners were transferred to countries such as France or Belgium, where they would be used as forced labor, assisting in the reconstructions. Others were taken to centers with better facilities, where they would spend the rest of their captivity. But for a large number of them, these camps became their tomb. According to Allied figures, approximately 6,000 prisoners died during the months in which these places were in operation. But other sources speak of much more macabre figures, stating that in reality, there were more than 1 million. Even decades after the event, there are questions that remain unanswered. Why were so many prisoners taken, knowing that the camps could not accommodate that number? Why were they systematically denied food, drink, and medicine? Why were they treated in such a brutal way? For many of the survivors, the explanation is clear. It was not a matter of logistics, but rather it was all coldly calculated. It was a plan to wipe out the German people, but for many of the Allies, any kind of cruelty against Nazi prisoners of war was justified after plunging the entire world into such a brutal war. Adolf Hitler dreamed for years of conquering Moscow, the capital of the then Soviet Union. The Führer was obsessed with raising the flag of the Third Reich in that city, the emblem of the communist enemy that was fighting with the Nazis for control of the world order, and he deployed considerable military resources to achieve that goal. In July 1944, The Germans finally marched through the streets of Moscow, but they carried the weight of defeat on their shoulders. The same ground they were now walking defeated had been the scene of a brutal battle against Joseph Stalin's men, who were willing to do anything to prevent the destruction of the Russian Empire. Blood, death, and much shame stained the Nazi flag, which this time could not wave in the face of a new conquest. In this video, we will analyze the terrible defeat that led 57,000 German soldiers to endure a degrading display of submission to Soviet power. Join us on this incredible and, until now, little-known adventure of World War II. Let's begin. On June 22, 1941, one of the most famous military operations of the war began, called Barbarossa, in which Germany and its allies invaded Soviet territory. It was a systematic effort to annihilate entire towns, destroy all their infrastructure and productive enterprises, and confiscate the food supply of the occupied regions. The Nazis left behind a trail of devastation. However, this operation had a primary strategic objective: to conquer Moscow and thus destroy the heart of the Union led by Stalin through a swift and direct attack. At that time, a large part of the world's population feared a triumph by the Führer. Hitler's offensive strategy, his weapons power, his rapid and successive victories throughout Europe, and high morale driven by the regime's propaganda projected them as the undisputed winners. However, this well-oiled military machine gradually began to show its limitations. Russia's vast territories, the polar cold that characterized its winters, and the enormous size and strength of the Red Army showed that it would not be possible to finish off the Soviets so easily. The Germans began to suffer several consecutive defeats. After 5 months, the Axis countries had suffered almost 1 million casualties, and their objective of conquering Moscow was literally frozen.
En el invierno de 1941, los soviéticos lograron reagruparse y frenar el avance alemán justo a las puertas de Moscú, y posteriormente los hicieron retroceder varios kilómetros. La contraofensiva soviética durante la batalla de Moscú terminó sentenciando el fracaso de la guerra relámpago en el este, y junto con ello se desvaneció cualquier entusiasmo por un gran desfile alemán en la Plaza Roja.
This story is probably familiar to you. What you may not know is that there was another large-scale military deployment 3 years later, which would have a fundamental relevance in the fate of the war. We are talking about Operation Bagration, a sophisticated strategy by the Soviet Union launched on June 22, 1944. You may wonder, why that name? It was chosen in honor of Pyotr Bagration, a Georgian prince who fought against the French during the Napoleonic Wars, and who also played an important role in Leo Tolstoy's renowned book, War and Peace. A true emblem of Russian literature, used here for other, perhaps not so poetic purposes. Through Operation Bagration, the Red Army advanced devastatingly through Belarus, reconquering the territories of Lithuania, Poland, and Romania along the way, thus dealing a decisive blow to Nazi hopes of controlling Europe. The ideological war initiated by the Third Reich had marked a significant shift from a conventional conflict to a genocidal one. The German military, aligned with the vision of Adolf Hitler and other Nazi leaders who saw the Soviet Union as a bastion of dangerous Judeo-Bolshevism, had until then implemented atrocious policies such as forced labor, starvation of prisoners of war and Soviet civilians, and campaigns aimed at the extermination of Jews, Communist Party officials, commissars, and partisans. However, as the war progressed, they began to run out of sufficient resources and soldiers ready to deliver the final blow to the ever-stronger Soviets. the destructive power of the Red Army had been focused on a single goal: to destroy Nazism without mercy. Operation Bagration is not remembered enough by history books and popular culture, perhaps in part because it was overshadowed by another iconic operation launched on June 6, 1944. The Normandy Landings, also called D-Day. This maneuver, led by the Allied forces, especially by U.S. troops, consisted of one of the most important naval, air, and land operations in history. Its code name was Overlord, and its success allowed the opening of a new front in Western Europe, both to weaken German dominance in the area and to relieve the pressure that the Soviet Union was suffering. Bagration, although less known, was equally crucial to the final outcome of World War II for several reasons. Let's look at them in detail. First of all, this operation carried out by the Soviet Union forced German units to divide between two fronts: the western one, against the Allies led by the United States and Great Britain, and the eastern one, where they fought against the Red Army. As the conflict escalated, the Americans pressed from their position in the west, while the Soviets did the same from the east. Hitler's men were trapped between two enemy walls that were slowly closing in on Berlin. Prior to the offensive, partisan units behind German ranks in Belarus, Poland, and the Baltic states contributed by disrupting supply lines and sabotaging enemy infrastructure. Following a massive bombing campaign by the Soviets, more than 2 million Red Army troops were mobilized, both frontline and support. The battle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union also showed an overwhelming disparity in terms of numbers and firepower. The Red Army managed to muster around 45,000 artillery pieces and more than 6,000 tanks and assault guns, while on the German side, there were only 3,200 artillery pieces and 570 tanks and assault guns. Perhaps the huge numerical disadvantage was impossible to overcome and contributed to the abrupt downfall of Nazism. Here is another key point about Stalin's strategy. After the initial defeats, the Soviets had narrowed much of the technological gap that separated them from the Nazis. Part of this improvement was due to the growing competence of the Soviet Union at the military level, in the construction of tanks and more powerful weapons. Operation Bagration thus demonstrated a military force that had reached maturity and professionalism. This also reflected a German army that was operationally moving in the wrong direction. Following Hitler's directives, who disapproved of mobile operations because they often entailed loss of territory, Field Marshal Ernst Busch, Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Center, opted for a static defense. The Germans thus focused on holding off the onslaught of Stalin's men from a series of fortresses along the front. These defenses were in cities and towns located on communication lines that had to be defended to the last man. Operation Bagration thus became a paradigmatic example of blitzkrieg, but this time it was the Soviets, not the Germans, who were carrying it out on the Eastern Front. The Red Army strategically surrounded these positions, suffocating the German forces that were trapped inside. The Soviet advance took the Germans completely by surprise, thanks in part to the effective technique of maskirovka, which translates to deception. The Red Army successfully deceived the enemy of its intentions and effectively coordinated its armored forces, artillery, infantry, and supply lines, achieving deep penetrations of up to 350 miles into the German lines. They advanced in powerful spearhead formations, isolating enemy units left behind. This tactic was made even more effective by a disastrous decision by Hitler, who ordered Army Group Center to hold out without giving ground to any Soviet advance. The Führer's directive stipulated that his strongholds were to be the central pillar of the German defense. There was to be no retreat before the enemy, whatever the cost. This strategy, as we shall see, proved completely inadequate in the face of the Red Army's tactics and power. The battle continued without respite, with the negative results of the battle, Hitler's army began to distrust the Führer's directives. General Jordan of the 9th Army was very concerned about the vulnerability that this static defense made for the Nazi forces, even correctly predicting that if a Soviet offensive broke out, the army would have to go over to a mobile defense or see its front shattered. And so it was. Hitler's orders to hold the line were a complete and utter disaster. He refused to allow his generals any flexibility or room for maneuver, which was contrary to all the precepts and teaching of the German general staff. Because Hitler distrusted his generals so much, he wanted to have everything under his control, and this led to a total failure on the battlefront. Ultimately, the Soviet attack culminated in the greatest defeat in German military history. Over the course of 8 weeks of fighting, the Nazis suffered approximately 390,000 casualties, surpassing the losses in the bloody battles of Stalingrad and Tunisia. It thus became the costliest campaign of World War II for Germany in relation to the number of lives lost, which even exceeded the deaths in the Battle of Verdun during the First Major War. These devastating losses resulted in the destruction of 28 German divisions and the collapse of Army Group Center, one of the 4 formations operating on the Eastern Front. For their part, the Soviets suffered approximately 5 times fewer casualties, making Bagration one of the most successful military actions of the war.
El éxito de la operación se puede resumir en la siguiente cita de un historiador. La operación Bagration le había arrancado el corazón al ejército alemán en el este, significando un punto de quiebre de la guerra en el frente oriental y desde cuyo momento el ejército rojo no se detuvo hasta llegar a Berlín.
The simultaneous assaults on the German position in June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy, and the Soviet attack from the east made it clear that the defeat of the Third Reich was only a matter of months away. As we see, the initiative on the Eastern Front was now in the hands of Stalin and the Red Army, which had managed to combine a clear numerical and armament superiority, together with an increasingly competent officer corps, to exploit these advantages. As a result of the offensive in Byelorussia, units of the Wehrmacht, the unified armed forces of Nazism, and SS troops lost almost 500,000 soldiers, and Army Group Center ceased to exist altogether. Bagration was arguably the most devastating military action and a key step in ending the era of Nazism. The operation shattered the backbone of the Wehrmacht. Beyond the 390,000 German soldiers who fell in combat, 160,000 were captured as prisoners of war, many dying on the way to concentration camps or due to the harsh living conditions there. Most of these captured soldiers never returned alive to Germany. The Third Reich, which had promised its people global rule for 1,000 years, was on the brink of collapse after just over a decade of coming to power.
Como consecuencia de esto, desde la cúpula del Politburó, los altos dirigentes soviéticos afirmaron que valía la pena celebrar un éxito tan rotundo. Y aunque la operación Bagration aún no había concluido, el Kremlin decidió realizar un desfile oficial en Moscú. Pero a diferencia de los típicos desfiles donde suelen marchar las tropas vencedoras, para esta ocasión, su realización se centraría en los vencidos.
Stalin could not leave Hitler's defeat at that. To keep the wound open and visible, he decided to hold this parade, forcing 57,000 German soldiers to march as a symbol of Soviet victory. The operation to transport German prisoners of war to Moscow and hold the Parade of the Defeated was named after the 1938 American musical film The Great Waltz, which was very popular in the Soviet Union. This may present a great irony, since the Americans became their enemies soon after the war ended. The purpose of the procession was not only to raise the spirits of the Russian people, but also to show the Allies and the world the magnitude of the Red Army's achievements.
La operación Gran Vals inició con el envío de prisioneros de guerra alemanes a la capital soviética. La mayoría de ellos habían sido capturados en Minsk, luego de la recaptura de Bielorrusia durante Bagration. Sin embargo, Del casi medio millón de hombres capturados, era evidente que no todos estarían aptos para resistir la procesión de varios kilómetros por la capital soviética.
In response, the crowd of captured soldiers was given a thorough medical examination to select the fittest, able to endure the planned parade of their defeat. To ensure that no one was left behind, the Russians fed the Germans rations of bread and butter. However, they were forbidden to bathe. In the eyes of Muscovites, the Nazis were to appear in miserable conditions. Beginning on July 14, 1944, trainloads of German prisoners began to arrive in the city. It was decided to house them at the Dynamo Stadium and the Moscow Hippodrome. The operation was carried out in the utmost secrecy. Even many military officers and party functionaries had no idea what was happening. In the early hours of July 17th, the people of Moscow were informed via radio about the shocking procession of prisoners. Crowds soon gathered and witnessed the sight of German soldiers marching with their heads bowed in large columns of 600 men, 20 per row. Defeated and humiliated before the world, the 57,000 soldiers of the Wehrmacht marched through the garden ring of Moscow. Although their desire to reach the Soviet capital had been fueled for years by Nazi propaganda, this was not the expected victory parade, but a parade of the defeated. The Nazi dream of marching through Moscow had come true, but not in the way they had imagined. The captured soldiers of the Wehrmacht looked in surprise at the beautiful buildings that rose along the garden ring. The city they had besieged in 1941 was openly humiliating them, just months before the Red Army reached Berlin. Thousands of citizens crowded the streets of Moscow. For once, there was no jubilation among the public, not a single celebration, a smile or a shout of joy. There was absolute silence, a devastating silence. The anguish, anger, and rejection could be seen on people's faces. Mothers and sons, grandmothers and uncles who had lost their sons on the battlefront and now found themselves face to face with a tired and defeated enemy. Only one sound broke the funeral silence, that of soldiers' boots against the pavement. There were thousands, tens of thousands of soldiers crossing the streets of the capital. Generals, corporals, and colonels. Although some bowed their heads in shame, there was also a feeling of relief, of knowing that the war was nearing an end.
Por un lado, a los generales y coroneles se les permitió marchar bien arreglados y con sus condecoraciones puestas, mientras que los hombres de la infantería debían hacerlo con la misma ropa que habían sido capturados.
As we see in these pictures, at the head of the march were the generals and colonels, clean-shaven in full uniform and adorned with medals. The high-ranking military officers walked with golden laurels on the edges of their collars and high-ranking officers' caps, with embroidered ruffles and identification badges on their chests and arms. They were followed by more than 1,000 officers and a multitude of infantrymen. There was no special display for the latter. They marched in the same conditions as they had been captured.
Вообразите их с оружием в руках, за броней танков, такими, какими они были еще несколько дней назад, с Красной армией, разгромившей эти полки, дивизии и корпуса гитлеровской армии.
On both sides of the column of prisoners, Soviet cavalrymen with drawn swords and soldiers of the internal troops with rifles at the ready and bayonets fixed were accompanying them. This was an excellent opportunity to demonstrate the strength of the Red Army and to raise the spirits of the citizens. In Russia, this conflict is still known as the Great Patriotic War for a reason.
But shadowing the parade were 12,000 NKVD officers and tens of thousands of heavily armed troops to ensure the crowds didn't interfere with the Germans, nor the Germans escape or rebel. In fact, Muscovites mostly watched the Germans in silence, with the occasional shouted insult. Any attempt to hurl things at the prisoners was immediately stopped by the guards.
The Russian newspaper Pravda published these lines about the parade. Disgusting green mold spilled from the hippodrome onto the clean and always so festive Leningrad highway. And it was strange to see that these motley two-legged rags had backs, even arms at their sides and other secondary signs of humanity. Failed masters of the planet, they passed by us, lanky and goitrous, with their hair standing on end, like the demons from the Chronicles. Behind the columns of prisoners were tanker trucks, which abundantly watered the sidewalks. This was to symbolically cleanse Moscow of filth, to wash the asphalt of the streets of the evil Nazi spirits that had paraded in the recent procession. According to some sources, the German command was so enraged by the humiliation of its soldiers in Moscow that it hastily organized its own parade in Paris, marching American and British prisoners through the streets of the city. It was a feeble attempt to demonstrate the Third Reich's waning power, since it could not compare in any way with the Nazis' parade through Moscow. Joseph Stalin had achieved his goal. This would perhaps be the last time such an event would happen. Thanks to the Geneva Convention of 1949, the treatment of prisoners of war was regulated, and such demonstrations were prohibited. However, no one managed to take away from Stalin the pleasure of having taken revenge on Hitler in such a degrading way, using the same mass propaganda techniques that the Führer had developed for a decade. The Soviets had surpassed the Nazis strategically and militarily in less than 3 years. It would take them little time to reach Berlin and push the Führer to a dramatic end. In the heart of Bavaria stands Landsberg, a prison where hundreds of people died in the most horrifying ways. Although it may seem unbelievable, many of the most infamous Nazi officers of World War II were executed there by the Allies. The level of sadism inflicted on these criminals was so extreme that political organizations mobilized to the prison gates to demand more humane treatment. In this new installment of Military History, we want to take you inside the most feared Bavarian prison, one whose floors are still stained with blood. Let's begin with this chilling episode.
Eagerly awaited in every part of the world was the climax to the long and strenuous months of the Nuremberg trial. While the judges were considering their verdicts, the military authorities were redoubling their security precautions.
Once World War II ended, it was time to hold accountable and punish those responsible for the most inhuman acts of the conflict. This process included a series of trials, but also the establishment of prisons controlled by the Allies within German territory. Among these facilities was Landsberg, in the southwest of the German state of Bavaria, about 65 kilometers west of the country's capital. The U.S. Army designated the facility as War Criminal Prison No. 1. Between 1945 and the mid-1950s, it was used to house dangerous soldiers and leaders of the Third Reich. For this reason, it was managed and guarded by the military police of the U.S. Army, with sentries well armed and instructed to shoot without hesitation at any suspicious movement. The first prisoners arrived at Landsberg prison in December 1945. From then on, the flow of Nazi soldiers and high-ranking officials was constant. New faces filled with hatred and fear of what would happen to them in a prison controlled by their enemies arrived day after day. Between 1945 and 1946, the facility housed a total of 110 inmates convicted in the Nuremberg trials. Another 1,516 war criminals from the aforementioned Dachau trials and 18 individuals convicted in the Shanghai trials. The latter were military tribunals conducted by U.S. forces in Japan between August 1946 and January 1947, aimed at prosecuting 23 German officials who had continued to assist the Japanese army after the surrender of Nazi Germany.
At the end of the conflict, there were hunts for those war criminals who had committed crimes against people inside the concentration camps, and the Allies also looked for people who had committed crimes against Allied soldiers. With this, many German civilians who had supported the Nazis found themselves accused of murdering Allied servicemen.
The facilities were similar to other prisons of the time, with cells designed for half a dozen prisoners and a notable lack of hygiene and maintenance. Of course, the guards had no regard for the well-being of the men behind bars. They were seen as the worst of the worst and were treated accordingly. From food shortages to constant psychological harassment, the Germans had an uncomfortable stay at the war criminal prison. Let's review one of the most significant dates in the history of that place. On October 16, 1946, the central courtyard of Landsberg prison was prepared for 10 executions and to accommodate several dozen spectators. This date had been set as the final day for several of the prison's most infamous inmates, individuals who, through money or actions, had fostered the most atrocious war crimes in modern history. In that penitentiary gymnasium, one of the loudest met his end shouting, "Heil Hitler!" It was Julius Streicher, editor of the newspaper Der Stürmer, who, through the dissemination of racist stereotypes, even in children's books published by his press, was one of the principal instigators of anti-Semitism in the Third Reich. These images were captured during his trial at Nuremberg.
He was responsible for the demolition on August 10, 1938 of the synagogue in Nuremberg. And on November the 10th, 1938, he spoke publicly in support of the Jewish pogrom which was taking place at that time. In the face of the evidence before the tribunal, it is idle for Streicher to suggest that the solution of the Jewish problem which he favored was strictly limited to the classification of Jews as aliens.
His influence led to the physical extermination of millions of people. But on that day in 1946, Streicher did not have the power to fight gravity. His body was about to be held by a rope tied to his neck, slowly suffocating him until the last spark of life was extinguished. When the mechanism was activated, blood and mucus bubbled from the Nazi's mouth, but he did not die. One of those present had to pull his legs hard and finally broke his neck. The person who assisted in the execution was Joseph Malta, who was then 28 years old. He was a military policeman sent to Landsberg to help with the control of the prisoners. Interviewed in the LA Times in 1996, 3 years before he died, he insisted that he did not regret anything. "It was a pleasure to do it. I would do it again." The difficult death of Streicher was no exception. There was a miscalculation in the length of the ropes, which meant that the prisoners did not die immediately, but rather in a long and tortuous process. Since they did not die from the cervical fracture, the Nazis were suffocating. From the 14 minutes that Joachim von Ribbentrop took, to the 24 that Wilhelm Keitel took. In his book Justice in Nuremberg, the researcher Robert E. Conant said that the scene was Dantesque. But after having heard all the testimonies and accusations that paraded through the trials, for those present, it evoked an almost biblical justice. The British press reported on the aforementioned problems with the length of the rope and that the condemned men hit their heads on the trapdoor when they fell. However, some experts consider that too much emphasis has been placed on the errors over the years for the sake of sensationalism. To this day, it is not known whether it was done intentionally in a position of revenge or simply a mistake.
A photographer would usually take a final photograph with the condemned stood over where they would seconds later be sent through. The executioner held the noose to the side, and he then took the condemned and placed a black cap over their head, before he finally secured the noose around their necks.
Joachim von Ribbentrop was able to utter a few sentences before the executioner activated the device. After expressing his love for Germany, the Reich's foreign minister said, "My last wish is for Germany to become one nation again, and for an agreement to be reached between the East and the West. I wish for the world to achieve peace." Words too solemn for a man who was an essential participant in Adolf Hitler's war machine. After the deaths of Streicher, Ribbentrop, and KlLED, the Allied military authority allowed the 30 present to smoke a cigarette. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, leader of the SS in Austria, said goodbye with a "Good luck, Germany." Alfred Rosenberg, on the other hand, left in silence. Hans Frank, governor of occupied Poland, smiling, said, "I thank you for the kind treatment I received during my captivity, and I pray to God that He accepts me in His mercy." The chief executioner was John Clarence Woods from Kansas. Most of the executions carried out in Landsberg prison bear his signature at the bottom of the documents. Time magazine recorded his statements after the famous October 16th. When asked if he had been nervous, he confidently replied no. A man cannot afford to be nervous in this business. After being examined by the doctor, the lifeless bodies of the Nazi leaders were collected by Rex Morgan, the American Army's chief undertaker in Europe. He placed the bodies in the coffins, where photos were taken and archived. He then transported them to the Dachau crematorium in Munich and, according to his son's publication, told the workers that they were American soldiers who had died in an aircraft accident. For 5.5 years, Landsberg prison was the site of the execution of nearly 300 war criminals condemned for heinous acts such as torture, experimentation, and civilian rape. If we differentiate according to the method used to end the criminals' lives, 259 death sentences were carried out by hanging and 29 by firing squad. A somewhat less painful but also more costly method due to the use of ammunition. These processes were carried out swiftly, demonstrating a compassion and humanity that in many cases the Nazis had not shown towards their prisoners. In 1948, the Association for the Welfare of Prisoners of the Bavarian Ministry of Justice was the organization responsible for managing the basic needs of prisoners detained by the American military. With the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949 and its abolition of the death penalty, appeals from politicians, churches, industrialists, and artists resulted in numerous petitions to close War Criminal Prison No. 1. It may sound strange in retrospect, but it was part of a widespread effort to move beyond the traumas of war and bring freedom to all Germans, even those who had committed inhumane acts during the conflict. In the latter half of 1950 and the first half of 1951, thousands of Germans participated in demonstrations outside Landsberg prison to demand pardons for all war criminals. Meanwhile, German media coverage was overwhelmingly on the side of the condemned, who were described as innocent victims of American lynch law. While the treatment received at this institution was not kind, the fact is that the purpose of the place was to carry out death sentences for some of the most savage and violent elements of the Third Reich. At Landsberg, young soldiers who had fought in the trenches or mechanics who had repaired planes in distant parts of Europe were not executed. Instead, it was there that men who had carried out the mass extermination of children, women, the sick, and the disabled were to be executed. Let us hear one of the many statements from the Nuremberg trials.
In connection with the administration of the concentration camps, the SS embarked on a series of experiments on human beings which were performed on prisoners of war or concentration camp inmates. These experiments included freezing to death and killing by poison bullets.
Although the protesters in Landsberg claimed to be motivated solely by opposition to the death penalty and to have no pro-Nazi or anti-Semitic feelings, their actions contradicted their words. When a group of Jewish protesters arrived in Landsberg demanding the execution of the 102 war criminals on January 7, 1951, the German protesters calling for amnesty began chanting the era's slogan, "Out with the Jews, out with the Jews," and then proceeded to beat the Jewish demonstrators. In early 1951, the Bavarian parliament passed a resolution declaring that all military prisoners in Landsberg, Werl, and Wittlich should be recognized as prisoners of war, making them the financial responsibility of the West German government. On January 2, 1951, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer met with the United States High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy, to argue that the status of the Landsberg prisoners was less a legal issue and more a political one, and that executing the Landsberg prisoners would forever ruin any attempt for the Federal Republic to play its role in the Cold War. The German government's position was straightforward. If we annihilate our former military leaders, how could we convince our population that we are now allies? On January 31, 1951, High Commissioner McCloy, under strong pressure from German public opinion, agreed to review the sentences from the Nuremberg and Dachau trials. Of the 28 prisoners sentenced to death, only 7 death sentences were confirmed. Some civilian prisoners who had collaborated with Adolf Hitler's regime were pardoned. The other sentences were commuted to effective prison terms, averaging around 15 years. Let's look at one of the many German reports on the matter.
Kurz nach seiner Ankunft hielt der Hohe Kommissar eine Pressekonferenz ab, in der die Richtlinien der künftigen amerikanischen Politik in Deutschland darlegte. Wörtlich sagte Deutschland muss zu einem friedlichen, freien und wohlhabenden Land gemacht werden.
The 7 death sentences confirmed by Commissioner McCloy were for what were considered the worst of the worst in Landsberg. These were criminals who had a direct impact on the Holocaust and whose actions had resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The infamous list included Oswald Pohl, Paul Blobel, Otto Ohlendorf, Werner Braune, Erich Naumann, Georg Schallermeyer, and Hans Hermann Schmidt. The German public was not satisfied with McCloy's decision, and as a result, during the first half of the 1950s, the Federal Republic continued to pressure the commissioner to pardon the 7 convicted individuals. Enormous weekly demonstrations were held, demanding amnesty for the Landsberg prisoners. The final executions took place on June 7, 1951, but several prisoners still remained to be dealt with. The government of the Federal Republic of Germany in Bonn decided that war crime convictions by military tribunals should be considered foreign sentences and, therefore, not part of an individual's criminal record. In May 1958, the United States Army relinquished control of Landsberg prison when the last 4 prisoners were released. This marked the end of a story filled with debates, conflicting positions, and political negotiations.
Germany and Landsberg jail, where Hitler wrote some of Mein Kampf, opens to release 29 of his followers, all war criminals, among them Hans KlLLED, former Minister of Church Affairs. Carrying flowers comes Alfred Krupp, head of the famous arms works, and sentenced to 12 years at Nuremberg. Now these former key men of Hitler's state face life as free men in post-war Germany.
To provide a context for what happened in that prison, by 1951, 284 war criminals had been executed there, their bodies were not claimed by their loved ones. Evidently, SS officers had a better reputation among post-war German politicians than among their own families. The remains were then buried in a cemetery near Spottingen Chapel. In 1988, that site was declared a historic landmark, and today, it is maintained with public funds from local taxpayers. This grants a more than questionable honor to those graves, especially considering that the cemetery does not clearly indicate who is buried there and why they were executed. In light of such controversy, we would like to involve you in this debate that has been ongoing for over 70 years. Do you think the Nazi prisoners at Landsberg were correctly executed, or should they have been treated as prisoners of war? Leave your response in the comments box. Now, let's take a closer look at the stay of the most infamous inmate in the history of this prison. Between November 8th and 9th, 1923, Munich was the epicenter of an event that, in the long run, changed the history of the entire planet.
Hitler and his movement had attempted to overthrow the government of the state of Bavaria following years of economic misery and political turmoil following Germany's defeat in World War I in 1918.
That rebellion failed, and Bavarian security forces managed to contain the members of the National Socialist Party, many of whom ended up behind bars in Landsberg prison, including the future Führer. In 1924, Adolf Hitler spent 264 days in prison, during which he wrote Mein Kampf, which can be translated as My Struggle, a manifesto outlining his worldview that he compiled and published with the help of Rudolf Hess. Hess became one of his trusted associates, an absolute fanatic who accompanied him for years during his political expansion. Adolf Hitler was released, smiling and proud, on December 20th, 1925. With 3 years, 333 days, 21 hours, and 50 minutes remaining of his brief 5-year sentence. This calculation was made by Ludwig Stenglein, the enraged prosecutor who had sought a severe punishment for the agitator who had committed the crime of high treason. It was the first brick in the construction of a new empire of terror. But what concerns us in this video is the penitentiary institution where he spent 9 months. A place that, over time, came under the control of various authorities, housing all types of prisoners. Today, the prison operates as a progressive correctional center that provides training, skills, and medical assistance to inmates. There are 36 courses in the Central Training Center offering training for occupations such as bakers, electricians, painters, butchers, carpenters, tailors, shoemakers, heating and ventilation workers, and masons. This chapter of Landsberg does not reflect at all the institution's turbulent past and all the bloodshed that occurred inside and outside its walls. Like all remnants of the Third Reich and the post-World War II occupation, its significance remains a subject of study and debate worldwide. Thus, we come to the end of this video. If you are interested in learning in detail about everything that happened in World War II, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel. That way, you can stay updated with all our material. With that, we say goodbye until the next edition of Military History. Thank you for joining us.